And Horror for All gang, it's gravelly voiced Tom here. Just woken up, not yet had my morning coffee, so I'll be doing that after this recording. I did, however, want to hop in front of the camera because a viewer of mine asked a very good question that I just wanted to answer. And their question was, what does it mean when I say that a horror film is horror for all? Obviously, the channel name is And Horror for All, so it makes sense to explain actually what I mean when I say that. For me, there are really two elements to it. So the first is whether or not a horror film can be enjoyed by people who proclaim to not enjoy horror films. Now, a lot of the films that fall into the scope of this, I think, are actually films that have horror elements or are categorized as horror films, but actually have a very strong other genre to them. So, for example, when Larry, Lucy, and myself were on this sofa watching Tenebrae, the video for that was out on Monday. Yes, Tenebrae is a horror film. Yes, it has very strong horror elements, but it was also a crime thriller, a police procedural type film as well. And overall, I think that made it a more enjoyable experience rather than just being sort of an out-and-out horror. So I would say that a film like Seven would be horror for all. Yes, it is a very, very gruesome, very, very intense film. I'd class it as a horror film, quite a strong horror film in several parts. But it's, a police thriller. It's, a mainstream, incredibly good cast, very well acted, very well directed film that I think actually probably a lot of people have seen Seven who would say that they don't like horror films. And for me, that makes Seven horror for all because, people watched it and appreciated it. I think a lot of horror comedies will fall into horror for all as well. So the first example I think of is Cabin in the Woods. That, although it has a lot of nods and winks for the horror fans who are watching it, the comedy, the tone, the acting, the cast, I think is such that it makes it a far more broadly enjoyable experience. So yeah, that's one definition of horror for all in my mind. The other definition is where a horror film is so good and so impactful that it basically transcends horror as a genre and actually just becomes part of great cinema. Now, a lot of the classic horror films will fall into this. So for 5 examples, I will say Alien, The Shining, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Exorcist, and Halloween. I would say all of those are horror for all. They are not, they are intense horror films, but they are great pieces of cinema. And certainly people who say that they like watching good films, classic films, I would say that those films would belong on that list and therefore should be watched by people just who have a love of watching quality films. It's not just for those classic horror films, I don't think. I think there are an awful lot of films that have come out over the last sort of 25, 30 years that I would classify as horror for all because of their impact on horror as a genre. I think a lot of people associate horror with, bad acting, cheap shocks, nasty gore, tits and arse for the sake of it, a bit of a juvenile genre in many ways, and there are certainly a lot of films that would fit into the scope of that. But if you were to say, sit down and watch Scream or more recently Midsummer, I think they are genuinely good examples of films that push horror forward, make it a far more interesting and exciting genre. And using the example of Midsummer, I think if someone was to tell you, oh, horror films are all just about, scantily clad women getting killed, show them Midsummer, and I'd like to think that their perceptions would be different, that you can make an emotionally honest, well-acted, well-written horror film. Yeah, and horror is just not nasty rubbish, basically. So yeah, so that's what I'm using to categorize horror for all. So to go back to an earlier example, When I reviewed The First Omen a couple of weeks ago, I said that it was not horror for all. And the reason for that was, firstly, it was too gruesome in parts, specifically around body horror and pregnancy. It was too gruesome in those areas to be, I think, broadly enjoyed by a lot of people. And honestly, whilst I did enjoy the film, it's not a classic, a classic piece of cinema. It's a good entry in the Omen universe, but it's not going to be, it's not going to enter the National Film Register or anything like that. So it's why a film can be good and enjoyable, but not horror for all. And I hope that kind of clears up the angle that I'm coming from. And yeah, ultimately, the idea is, if I say that a horror film is horror for all, it's the kind of film that you could use as an entry level film for, a partner, a wife, a friend who say that they don't like horror films. These may be the kind of films that you can use to just kind of bring them into that world and just kind of share those experiences with them. Because ultimately, I don't know about you, but I love watching horror films anyway, and I really appreciate it when people watch horror films with me. And if I can make it an enjoyable experience for them, I don't want anyone against their will on a sofa having to watch something that they hate. I'd like them to find it enjoyable as well, because ultimately all we have is our experiences with people, really. But damn, that was deep. Anyway, never mind that. I'm gonna go grab my coffee, and yeah, thanks for your time. Have a good weekend.